Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today we are doing Jaroslav Pelikan's History of Development of Doctrine, Volume 3, The Growth of Medieval Theology. So I really enjoyed reading this. It's been a little while since I've read systematic theology or theology systematically. I've read Jaroslav Pelikan's works. This is like a 5 or 6 volume series. I can't remember. Yeah, 5-volume series. See here, beep. And I've read probably read them all, but I think this is the first time I've read this volume cover to cover. And one of the great things about not being in the profession is that you don't have to read things selectively, that you can just read what the author's writing and soak it all in, not according to your own specific requirements at the moment, like if you're writing a paper on a certain topic or whatever, but you can read it on the author's, on the basis by which the author wrote the book. So his major themes, his major theories, the major structure of the work. As I said, I really enjoyed this. Pelikan, I remember reading about him a number of years ago. He has a little brief autobiography somewhere. It's just a short little thing. And he was brought up Lutheran, but he converted, I think, to Eastern Orthodoxy. And he's got the virtue of Pelikan is that nobody knows the languages as well as him, like all the languages, and has a real systematic, comprehensive understanding. So this makes this work a real benchmark, a real nice common reference point for anybody really of any doctrinal background. So the first volume deals with ancient Christianity. The second volume deals with the Eastern Church specifically, and then this one is the medieval Western Church. And then volume 4 would be mostly on the Reformation, and the 5th volume would be like, it says since 1700, so like modern stuff or whatever. And all the volumes are very good. He has a wonderful, comprehensive knowledge of the sources and so on, and the way he lays them out is pretty interesting. He doesn't do footnotes, so he does these marginal notations, which is okay. It's not too bad. Most of the sources are primary sources, but he will here and there mention secondary sources, so modern sources as well, studies and so on. Okay, so let me talk for a minute about who can read this book. Well, I guess anybody can read this book. If you're an anybody, obviously read the books in sequence. So tonight I'm drinking Tim Hortons. So I'll share that with you. That's why I'm probably talking faster than I normally talk. I'm drinking coffee. If you don't have a thorough acquaintance with the major contributors and so on of the tradition, then you might want to start with volume 1 and move your way up. But you would gain anything. You gain something from starting anywhere, right? And this volume is interestingly, what you could call it, like sort of the subcontext. So the second chapter is notably called Beyond the Augustinian Synthesis. And so basically what you get is you enter the medieval era. So we're talking about the Latin West right now. We're not talking about the Greek-speaking East side of the empire, but the Latin West. Augustine is the major theological source, obviously in addition to the Bible. But in terms of systematic theology, doctrine of grace, doctrine of the Trinity, doctrine of sacraments, spirituality, Augustine is the source. So oftentimes, like, Catholics will talk about the 4 Latin doctors or whatever, and say Jerome, Gregory, Ambrose, and Augustine. Well, there's no there's no equality among them. Augustine is the massive, towering authority in the medieval West, and St. Thomas Aquinas would be the authority like by the 14th century. So after Augustine, or sorry, after Aquinas, and a different age. So the first century and almost a half of Christian Western Latin Christian theology is dominated by Augustine. And so the reason why the second chapter says beyond the Augustinian synthesis is that it begins by saying, okay, here's what Augustine said, and here's the problems that were brought to Augustine, that because Augustine never thought about them, because they're modern, they're subsequent. So we're talking about could be this first Spanish theologians in the 7th and 8th century who had concerns with the theology of grace, the theology of the Eucharist. And so I found that very interesting. So Pelikan sort of identifies about 3 different moments, I think. So there was the initial heretical problems that were coming out of Spain, Visigothic Spain, which had been Arian and then was slowly brought into the main Catholic fold. But there's still some residual concerns and so on. And then Augustine's doctrine of grace was so contentious and problematic in a sense, because Augustine seemed to teach double predestination. And I found this book really good at helping to navigate some of those issues, even though it was one of my specialties. The theology of grace is very complex, very complicated, but also there's a history not just of Augustine's doctrine, but of the centuries after him and what people made of his doctrine. So I think basically Pelikan talks about the first problems were Christological and Eucharistic, both from Spain and then from, I guess we'd call it modern day France. There was a Eucharistic controversies because Augustine, like what Augustine said about the sacraments, he said in general terms. Like he was the guy who talked about how sacraments have power in and of themselves, and that some sacraments are dependent upon the minister, like marriage is dependent upon the intentions of the 2 people getting married, whereas other sacraments like the Eucharist aren't as dependent. You just got to follow the form, and then the mystery happens. But what is the mystery? What is the doctrine? And the doctrine of transubstantiation, in a nutshell, doesn't come along until basically the 12th century with, say, Peter Lombard. But that the different ideas about, well, what is this kind of thing, and how, this is the real body and blood of Christ, real, is fine, but it's not a very exact word, like what is real. Whereas with the introduction of Aristotelian philosophy just before Aquinas, say in the 12th century, or sorry, the 13th century, no, 12th century, then you're able to use different words like substance and accidents and all that stuff. That's when the doctrine of transubstantiation comes along. So Augustine had developed, he was really the first person to really develop sacrament of theology of the sacraments, but he didn't really spin out all the implications of the sacraments. And in fact, I think it's Peter Lombard as well, who's the first guy who'll come along and say, yes, there are 7 sacraments, and here's the 7, right? So after the Eucharistic controversies, say during the age of Charlemagne, so with Alcuin and all those R-lettered guys, so Ratramus, they're all like R-letter words. Then there's Goschalk, I don't know how to pronounce his word, Redbertus, Ratramnus. These are so they're all fighting about the Eucharist, like what is the Eucharist? And then Berengar of Tours came along later, and they were all trying to analyze what the fathers of the church were saying about the sacraments. whereas Augustine contributed the most to the sacramental theology. It was St. Ambrose, for instance, who is more explicit in saying this is the real body and blood of Christ, or whatever that is. It's not a metaphor, it's not a spiritual sense, it's an actual sense, whatever actual means. Okay, so Eucharist and Christology, and then Eucharist, of course, were the first big controversies, and that leads us up to basically the age of Charlemagne and beyond. And then somewhat later in the age of say Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Abelard, these people, they have different controversies about the Eucharist still, but they're also dealing with the matters of the Trinity and so on. And in this case, I don't really find that anyone really advanced on Augustine's Trinitarian theology, where they did advance on his sacramental theology. Let me just look here to see if I can get any, if these titles will help trigger some things. Okay, so yeah, so during the age of Bernard and Abelard and Anselm, so we're talking about the 11th century, the big debate then was over the matter of grace, predestination, providence. What can we say about how does God decide about, what is God's decision about who goes to heaven, who goes to hell mean, about his will, about free will, about all that stuff. So that was the big controversy during probably during the what they call the birth of Scholasticism in the age of Saint Anselm, which is really good, really cool. And Pelikan liked to talk a lot about Saint Anselm and his cur deus homo. So why did God become man? That's very important for Pelikan. So it's the first sense, and he says this is really the first time when the human arts, so logic, rhetoric, philosophy, grammar, all these things are brought in to make theological judgments. So theology is supposed to be a matter of faith, right? Well, here we have St. Anselm using logic and saying, okay, we know that this is the faith, but is it reasonable? And how do we show how reasonable it is, right? And so his most famous writing is Cur Deus Homo, one of his most famous. And why did God become man? So he talks about how the debt of sin needed to be paid by a God-man, right? Which is super interesting. So that would be mainly dealt with in the third chapter called The Plan of Salvation. And the communication of grace was not strictly talking about what I was talking about with Augustine's doctrine of predestination and so on, but talking about how Mary comes on the scene is very important. The communion of saints, how the doctrine of the saints gets sort of developed, because frankly there was no sort of real understanding of those things, real codification. So you have all these churches named after saints, and you have miracles and this and that, but there's no doctrine of the saints really codified until we come to the 10th, 11th centuries, right? And I think really the last thing that Pelikan, at least to me, the last thing that Pelikan really focuses on is talking about faith and reason. So, and that's one big thing with when the West rediscovers the works of Aristotle just before Aquinas in, say, the 12th century, the whole idea of what can we know by faith, what can we know by reason, and how do the two interrelate, and that this is something Pelikan says is something that sure satisfied Aquinas, Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, Albertus Magnus, these great scholastics in the 13th century, but the problem was that it wouldn't be satisfactory later on, so in the centuries ahead, right? So there you have it. Remember, this is medieval theology. This is not medieval religion, and this is not medieval life. This is medieval theology. Although there are some references to life, daily life, and so on at the time. I think you have to know medieval history and medieval social history and so on too, if you're really going to get a holistic sense of what happens there. And it's funny, I don't even think Pelikan mentions the rise of universities. Maybe he mentioned universities once or twice, but isn't it interesting? He just examines the thought of the different people. He doesn't make much of the fact that in the world of Saint Bernard and Saint Anselm, that was monastic. That was theology done by monks in monasteries, and that by the time we get to Aquinas in the 13th century, this is theology done by, yes, priests and religious people, but in universities. So that's one thing I found that he didn't make much of a deal about. What did I learn from this? I think it helped me get straight who the different people are at different times. One thing, Joachim Fiore, I thought he was like a 14th or 15th century guy, but he wasn't. He was a 11th century guy. So I'm going to have to look into that. That was the one thing. Whoops. So I learned more about the different people like Gottschalk and Ratramnus and all them, Rodbertus, which is good. Gave me a sort of a better sense of the stages of thought, like what people were, what status, say, the Eucharist was in, the doctrine of the Eucharist was in, say, in the 9th century, and what status it was to get later, and how it was to develop. So that I found that helpful. Yeah. So I think just in that sense that the book gives you a good sense of the general themes and general interests of the centuries, right? These giant issues and how they were dealt with. And it's not political at all. So although there are some references to councils, Council of Soissons, which condemned Abelard, wasn't it? And then different councils like in Spain that condemned different doctrines of the Eucharist. But it didn't, and it did make a quick reference, I think, to the trouble that the Bishop of Paris gave to Aquinas, but not much. So it didn't focus much on the papacy. And one thing it was interesting. One thing Pelikan points out is that if you know St. Thomas's Summa Theologica, you know that he doesn't. There's no big question on the church. He doesn't deal with the topic of the church. He takes church for granted. He talks about the sacraments, talks about the different, he talks about the angelic hierarchy and all that stuff, but doesn't really talk about the doctrine of the church. But one thing that Pelikan says is that that's misleading in a way, because other people were. Okay, so we know that, for instance, Suitor Dionysius wrote about the church, the celestial and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, which makes Aquinas's neglect of a doctrine of the church so much stranger. But Joachim Fiore and different writers did talk about that doctrine, but it wasn't incorporated into the systematic theology of the scholastics in the 13th century. So people like different spiritual writers did, like Bernard, and I know there's some other people I'm forgetting. Maybe the Vincentians, the Victorines, Hugh of St. Victor, and Richard of St. Victor. So it was more of a topic of spiritual theology rather than systematic theology. So anyway, I love this book to pieces. I think I'm going to read the previous volume to this, the volume 2 on the Eastern Church. I think I'll read that one next, because I have read the other 3 volumes quite extensively. I don't think cover to cover, but quite extensively over the years. And I think that you're going to get me talking more and more about different religious topics in future book reviews, I think. So we'll see what happens. So thanks guys for listening, and we'll get back to you real soon. Bye.